Okay, I'll go and get started. As I mentioned, I'm just going to kind of go through it this way so that way I can monitor if anybody's got questions as things pop up. Again, my name is Chris Hampson. I work with the Idaho Army National Guard. I'm also a certified environmental professional through the Academy of Board Certified Environmental Professionals. So they're an NGO. It's been around since like the 80s. And so what I'll do is go through, cover NEPA, kind of 101 basics.
Yeah.
I'm going to mute you, Sarah. Let's see if I can do that.
Yeah.
And so what I'll cover is history and purpose, updates to NEPA. It's kind of been a fast and furious 4 months. When it applies, I got different types of documents. I pulled up some information kind of relevant as it relates to Idaho Army National Guard, some BLM, Bureau of Land Management documents, and then I pulled some environmental impact statement, EIS information from the US EPA website. So with that, like I mentioned, please chime in. And so history and purpose, events leading to NEPA. I've got several images up here, but if you kind of come back to the beginning of the early 1900s, in 1918, Congress passed the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and that prohibits the take of protected migratory bird species without prior authorization from the Department of Interior. So it's kind of one of the first conservation-related laws that Congress passed in 1918. You follow that up with the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act of 1934, and that just directs Fish and Wildlife Service to investigate and report on federal actions that will affect any stream or body of water and to provide recommendations to minimize those effects on fish and wildlife species. And then in 1962, you had Rachel Carson. She wrote The Silent Spring, which was about the use of DDT and pesticides and those adverse effects in the environment. Then you had some incidences in the mid to, well, really the late 1960s. So here on the right, you've got the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969. So that was about 3 million gallons of oil into the Pacific Ocean. And then you have the Cuyahoga River fire in 1969. That was after the Santa Barbara oil spill. And the river was just ignited from industrial discharges into the river. And that river is in Cleveland, Ohio. So those events kind of led to Congress to, one, develop the National Environmental Policy Act. And so a couple of senators, Henry Jackson and Ed Muskie, so you had a Democrat and a Republican, they led the way on the act. And so you can see here they passed in December 23rd, 1969. And then Republican Richard Nixon signed it into law January 1st, 1970. And the actual title of the law is the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, even though it was passed in 1970. Other subsequent statutes that followed NEPA include the Clean Air Act amendments of 1970, Clean Water Act of 1972, Endangered Species Act of 1973. So, as most folks say, this is kind of the first truly environmental conservation law that Congress passed, and that a lot of countries and states have emulated and followed since then. So some history and purpose, some additional items. So President Nixon in 1970, he did an executive order that you can see there. I'm not going to read it, but it's basically, you'll see here CEQ. CEQ is the Council on Environmental Quality. So it's part of the statute, and I've got it down later and a couple other slides. The Council on Environmental Quality, they are in office in the executive branch, and they report directly to the president. And they're the agency that they're written into statute that they are the ones that are supposed to provide guidance to all the other federal agencies when conducting NEPA. And so they issued guidelines so that way all federal agencies follow similar rules and legislation. You'd see in 1970, they issued some interim guidance. Again, 71, 73, these are minor guidelines. But the big one was in 1977, President Carter issued his executive order, which was to tell CEQ develop a set of implementing regulations so that way every federal agency can go to CEQ and to basically guide to be the one federal agency that all federal agencies come to and look to guidance for. So there's consistency when implementing NEPA across the board. So there are various, and I have it, I think it's 42 United States Code, section 433(1) et al. There's several sections of the law where you have the spirit of the law. So generally it's kind of the general intent and framework. That is section 101. So, it establishes the responsibility that the federal government should, at the best of its ability, ensure that it's a good trustee of the environment, keep people safe from the, environment, attain beneficial uses, and really to enhance the quality of the environment and everything else. You get in the letter of the law, so that kind of guides what exactly goes into NEPA and what type of documentation that is generated. So, and I should have other regulations. So these are the procedural requirements to carry out the responsibilities of that. Then you get into, it also identifies ways for agencies to develop regulations. Note that each agency generates its own NEPA implementing regulations. And you can see here requires agencies to do their jobs and establish, as I mentioned, the Council on Environmental Quality. So, what is NEPA? Well, it's a federal law, and compliance is required. It's a process. It's procedural. Whereas if you think about the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, that is a requirement, and it's a statutory requirement, and it requires there are fines and everything else associated with it from there. So if you violate NEPA, it's just really bad press, and it can relate into significant project delays. It also requires you to look at all the different environmental effects before the decision maker, the federal agency, can make a decision. So any federal action must go through NEPA. And you'll see as we get into other items, there's, it's, and I'm going to pull this statement from Justice Kavanaugh. I'll get into it here in a few minutes, but NEPA, the first NEPA case through the U.S. Supreme Court in the last 3 or 4 decades, they just released, as you saw with the biweekly update on the 29th last week, they came down with their decision on that. And so basically NEPA doesn't require the agency to weigh environmental consequences in any particular way. It just has them to go through and to consider only the environmental impacts, only if the information could result in on which the agency can act. So you've got Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Sonia Sotomayor making those statements. So how is it compared to, as I was talking about, the Clean Air Act or other environmental laws? Well, this one, NEPA is multidisciplinary. It's all about disclosing information, using the best scientific information to make better decisions. And it requires coordinations with other laws, as I mentioned, you know, whether it's the Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, National Historic Preservation Act. You know, NEPA is, as they say, the umbrella law. So you can see that each NEPA document looks at how the federal action is either in compliance with and consistent with or not with all these other laws. So it's a kind of a clearinghouse, so to speak. Okay, so I mentioned that, you know, NEPA came out, or the law was signed in 1970. And then in 1978, you know, CEQ promulgated its rule for how you can update, modernize, and revise, you know, NEPA regulations. So let's go back to 2020. Even before then, in 2017, during President Trump's first go around, he directed CEQ to lead an interagency working group to identify and propose changes to NEPA regulations. You know, NEPA is the law that usually gets the short end of the stick when big, large federal projects are held up. So that was in 2017. and 2020, CEQ then promulgated its updates so that you can see sometimes it'll be interesting. You can see how long it takes to propose a rule through the Federal Register. So they proposed a rule in January, and then in July they had the final rule, and then it became effective in September of 2020. Well, then you have a changeover, and that was at the end of President Trump's first administration. Then you had President Biden. When he came into office in 2021, he issued his executive order, which revoked President Trump, his executive order directing agencies, and his executive order said, hey, we're going to rescind what I'll call the 2020 rule, and we're going to go through in two different phases to revise NEPA. So it's a pendulum. It swings from President Trump trying to streamline, so to speak, or condense, break down NEPA, and then the other administration, then President Biden's administration, come in and we got to go back to the old way of doing things. So you can see here in 2021, phase one came out in October, the final rule in April 20, 2022, and then that was effective in May 20, 2022. And there are three pieces that phase one did. It brought in what's called direct, indirect, and cumulative effects, whereas the 2020 rule only talked about reasonably foreseeable effects. It brought out some applicant kind of purpose and need driven language, and then there was one other item that I can't think of off the top of my head that the phase one rule did. Okay, so that was back in 2020. So then you go to, or 2021 and 2022. So you fast forward to Congress. Congress actually made the first substantive amendment to NEPA since 1983, and that was in you can see here June 3rd, 2023, called the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And what this did is it codified many of the provisions that were in the 2020 CEQ NEPA regulations, kind of more elaborating on the types of documents, time frames. You know, an environmental assessment should be done 1 year, the environmental impact statement in 2 years, et cetera, et cetera. So that was actual codified amendment that Congress passed in 2023. As a big change to NEPA. You'll see. So then, since then, CEQ went through and did their phase two revisions. So a lot of these revisions, so you've got each federal agency has their way that they develop their rulemaking process and how they guide NEPA. And to do that, you go through, as you can see here, the Federal Register. And then once it's done, then it says, okay, here are your rules. You go forth and follow the rules for this way. Whereas the Fiscal Responsibility Act amendment to the statute itself actually supersedes this. And but you can see here, the phase two rule was really bringing in climate change, environmental justice, a lot of more detail and information that has been largely driven by cases, court cases throughout the year. And so you see here, July 1st, 2024, those became effective. Now we jump into President Trump's second term after President Biden. Actually, before he even came into office, but in January 2020, there were several cases that went through the courts. I won't jump into it just for, no, I've got some time. There was, here you got the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. This was the one called the Marin Audubon case, where basically that one said CEQ doesn't have the authority to do rulemaking, and so that any NEPA implementing guidelines as it relates to the rulemaking process should be thrown out. That was 20 states challenged actually just the phase 2 rule of that. Then you've got in January, when President Trump took office, which most folks are familiar with, you have his unleashing, his energy emergency executive order, revoking a whole series of other executive orders, including President Carter's executive order for CEQ promulgating their NEPA implementing regulations. I'm probably getting into too much of the weeds for folks here, but that's okay. And he also got rid of the President Clinton's executive order on environmental justice analysis. And that was in January 20 of this year. And then February 3rd, the court on this phase 2 rule they came back and they said, yeah, CEQ doesn't have the authority to promulgate their rules. So that was in February 3rd. And as part of the executive order that President Trump authored, he told CEQ, hey, you have to go and streamline NEPA and basically go ahead and, since with what the courts have said, since you don't have any really primacy or jurisdiction to do these rulemakings for NEPA, go ahead and rescind them. So what CEQ did is in February 2025, they did their interim final rule rescinding their NEPA regulations. They provided a 30-day public comment period, which they said they didn't need to do, but they did anyways. And they said, regardless of the comments that come in, we're going to just take it all down. So if you even Google CEQ's NEPA implementing regulations was part in the code of figure. I can't remember which part it was, but they have since been rescinded and taken down. And what the CEQ also said is that, hey, we're going to require every federal agency, as I mentioned before, to rewrite or revise or however they want to do their own NEPA implementing regulations, and you have to do it by February of next year. And so they have a memorandum guiding federal agencies on how they should go about doing that in light of the current court case, the past court cases, and challenges and everything else. So fast forward to a couple months ago, CEQ sent around a template for agencies on what their NEPA implementing regulations should look like. It's interesting is the Department of Interior, since working with the Guard, we work with Bureau of Land Management a lot. So there's this alternative NEPA process. I could get into it if we have more time at the end, but the first project, if you go to BLM's e-planning website and you just Google this project, they did an environmental assessment in 14 days. So that just came out. Then you have guidance on the use of social cost of carbon. Basically, anything greenhouse gas related, you can keep in your affected environment and your discussion, but we're not going to get any more. They're not going to go down kind of the greenhouse gas climate change analysis way. Another thing to track, as folks have been hearing, the one big beautiful bill that the House recently passed on the 20th, there are actually NEPA revisions in it. Now, if it makes it through the Senate and then signed into law. I don't know what version it'll look like, but it's basically a pay-for-play type thing to where an applicant can come in and say, I think this document or this project's, I think it's the document, is going to cost, let's say, $10. And this language says, well, if you do 125% of that, so $12.50, then you get this accelerated review, and people can't sue you. So that's interesting. And then, as I mentioned, the Supreme Court case that just came down, and basically the project is, if you didn't read the newsletter, says that the board correctly looked at all the environmental effects, whereas the objectors said, no, you've got to go further and look at upstream and downstream, what they say effects. I won't get into that too much here in this call, but it's basically kind of almost narrowing the amount that each agency should look at. How much do you look at? Basically, do you go down the rabbit hole or not? So I've talked a lot about history. So everyone's like, okay, well, when is it required? Well, you have to have a federal action, or what's known as a federal nexus. And basically that's if you get federal funding, you need a federal permit, you're on federal land, or you need some sort of other federal authorization. And you can see here with these pictures, each agency has their own kind of handbook or their policy on how they actually conduct NEPA. So even within the Department of Interior, you'll have two different handbooks with two different ways that each agency does it. That's another kind of, a lot of the comments that were received during the comment period when CEQ was rescinding their implementing regulations. Folks said you're going to cause chaos as opposed to create consistency throughout the federal government. So we'll see where that shakes out. So when is it required? Policies, plans, programs, projects. Projects and programs are the biggest ones. Plans, if you're familiar with Bureau of Land Management, you have your resource management plan. So that's typically tied to theirs to, why that's identified as far as when NEPA applies. And basically, NEPA is really just there to provide the decision maker we've looked at these different alternatives. We've looked at the pros and cons of the proposed action that you have control over, and you can make your decision based on that. Let's see. When you get into NEPA analysis, you look at everything in the context of the environment. It's both human and the physical. So you can see here, you've got a whole host. Usually there's about 23 or some odd different types of resource topic areas that you look at. Oh, I should probably update this slide because we're not supposed to be looking at that anymore. And cultural resources, that encompasses everything, whether it's historic, archaeological, paleontological, tribal. Typically, tribes are sovereign nations, so you have to do government-to-government consultation to make sure that we're respecting their jurisdiction boundaries. Biological resources encompasses, as I like to say, birds, bunnies, and bees, and then plants and everything else. So now moving forward into the type of document. So I mentioned, NEPA is a procedural statute, is a procedural law that requires a federal agency, when they have a federal action, which I mentioned is federal funding or a project, to look at the potential effects on the environment that it has. And so how do you document that? Well, there are three different types of documents that are specifically now identified in the statute. You have categorical exclusions, or CADEXs, or there are different acronyms depending on the federal agency you're in. Those are the most common. So about 95% of the projects fall under a categorical exclusion. What that means is there's no significance. So you take a threshold, or when you say significance, that means there's going to be a significant effect on the environment. So you're getting rid of an endangered species, or you're impacting an endangered species, for example. Well, if you don't have any significant effect on that topic or that species, then you can utilize a categorical exclusion. Also means you can't segment. Segmentation means you can't take a larger project, break it up into smaller projects to use CADXs for each one. You got to look at the whole of the action. Or if there's no extraordinary circumstances, as I mentioned, so like an Endangered Species Act. So typically that document could be 1 page, it could be 45 pages. There's no guideline for that. And as I mentioned, various agencies have various types of those documents. The next document is environmental assessment, as I mentioned. So that says, hey, we don't know if there's going to be a significant effect, but basically we think that we're not going to have a significant effect. So you have your environmental assessment. As I mentioned, the statute now says your environmental assessment can't be more than 75 pages, and you have to have it done in 1 year. And again, you can scope out resource areas that aren't pertinent to the decision, and you can streamline items that way. So you'll have your environmental assessment, and then you'll have what's called the finding of no significant impact, and that's your decision document that the agency decision maker says, hey, this is the type of document, and here's the analysis that we looked at. That's probably 1 to 5% of the documents out there. Environmental impact, that should be statements, not assessments. Those are significant effects. So yeah, likely you'll be impacting endangered species and requiring take and all those. Those are much more laborious. Now it's 150 pages for the limit, but if you have an extraordinary circumstance, it's 300 pages and you're supposed to be done in 2 years. The type of document that follows that is the record of decision. And so it's just a longer time. It's a more in-depth process. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the history, NEPA, the documents, the style of documents, what goes into it, history. So what I did is at the beginning of May, I went back through and I said, okay, so for us, Idaho AEP, for folks who either are directly involved in NEPA documentation or are just now hearing about it, I said, okay, what type of environmental impact statements have been done in Idaho since 2020? And so you could go to the US EPA's website. They're the clearinghouse for environmental impact statements. So you can see since 2020, 35 EISs across federal agencies have been completed in Idaho. I highlighted in bold on the right, the Bureau of Land Management had completed 12 and the Forest Service had completed 10. And that's largely because of their resource management plans are typically associated with the level of an EIS. Same with the Forest Service and their plans that they generate. So you can see here that they make up the vast bulk, and that's true across the nation, is that the Department of the Interior is largely the one who generates the most environmental impact statements, environmental assessments, and then you can even go on down through there. So they probably generate a ton of categorical exemption documents. You see here, I know we have some ITD folks that are on the call right now. So ITD can do their own categorical exemptions on their transportation projects because they have a programmatic agreement with the Federal Highway Administration. And so the latest version was signed back in 2023. And so the state can go through and then depending on, again, the level of the documentation requirement, go through and do NEPA as a state employee. And then if it's a large project, then the federal employee with FHWA will then be the one that can go through and be the decision maker on that. I'll open it up if other folks on here know of other state agencies that have recently worked on NEPA documentations. You could throw in the chat, or once I stop chatting here in a few slides, we can have a group discussion. So I figured that was interesting. More specific to the Idaho National Guard. So, we work with the Army National Guard. They're the federal agency. And so any of our projects within our military training lands, we do NEPA. And just for folks here, you can see we've done environmental assessments, various environmental assessments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 EAs since 2010. And within our training lands, you can see here, we do probably about 10 categorical exclusions each year. Statewide, we do more CADXs than that. You can see we have a training MOU with Bureau of Land Management. Then ACUB, that's the Army Compatible Use Buffer Program. I'm not going to get into that. And then we have the Installation Compatible Use Zone. So that's kind of just to deconflict military conflicts with encroaching land use that might be incompatible with the military mission, or ACUB is kind of buying land that we can help restore and restore basically, so that way we can keep training. One thing that folks can do, if you're not familiar, Bureau of Land Management, they've got their National NEPA Register. And so what I did is I went into it and I searched just for numbers. The National Conservation Area, if you're not familiar with it, it's the Morley Nelson Snake River Birds of Prey National Conservation Area. It's a congressionally mandated area for the protection of raptor species. And so in conjunction with BLM, you could see that just within the NCA, BLM since 2020, 91 projects have been reviewed. So you can see the breakdown: 6 environmental assessments, 16 determination of NEPA adequacies, that's the categorical exemption document, and 77 just straight CADXs. And you can see 2 EISs have been done within the NCA. So from Idaho down to kind of the greater Treasure Valley area, those are just some documentation efforts. CEQ does have their website. It's still up. It's hosted by, I believe, the Energy Department. And so they'll have all of the full text of the NEPA statute. They'll have websites, regulations, guidance documents, studies, those sorts of things to help folks who are unfamiliar with NEPA, or just even new practicing federal NEPA practitioners or private practitioners. You go there and review that and get caught up on those. So in conclusion, I've been talking for at least 30 minutes now. I'm sure everyone's fallen asleep, but types of documentations: CADXs, as I mentioned, 95% of the time, EA 1 to 5%, EIS is probably less than 1% of the time. What does NEPA do? It provides an avenue for environmental analysis of a reasonable range of alternatives. You want to do it early in the process and involve folks to maybe deconflict a contentious project. It invites various levels of public participation. What it doesn't do is it doesn't stop a project. It's just a process, so that way you can make a better informed decision. And then, as I mentioned, it's changing now more than ever. So if you're a private practitioner, you got to be caught up on these things. That way you can provide the most appropriate business approach for each of your clients. With that, I'll end it there and mute and drink some water and see if anybody has any comments, questions, thoughts. So go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Cancel. Just a question for the group: am I still sharing my screen?
No.
Okay, perfect.
Chris, just a recommendation. This is John Irving. If you're interested in trying to keep up with all the changes that are occurring, you'd find the NEPA Working Group's monthly call very up to date. They're discussing things as they change and so forth. And so look to the newsletter for the date. It's usually the second Wednesday of every month, but sometimes it changes.
Yeah, thank you, John. And to that point, since I work for the Department of Defense, they're actually going to take all of the various federal agencies. So as I mentioned, you have the Department of the Interior, where you've got the Forest Service, BLM, USDA, and all of them. The Department of Defense, you've got Navy, Army, Air Force, Coast Guard, and all of them, they're going to wrap each of our agencies have our own specific way of doing NEPA and implementing NEPA. They're going to here this summer promulgate their rule saying nope, everyone's going to fall under DoD and everyone's going to do it the same way. So being tied in, luckily with where I'm at and tied in, I'm able to get that information quickly. But yeah, no, that's a great point, John, that for those curious on different agencies and what they're doing, if agency folks decide to speak up, you could get a lot of valuable information there. Yeah, I must have either done a good job or everyone fell asleep.
You did do a good job.
You did a great
Chris.
job.
Thank you.
Chris and others, is anybody worried that NEPA is going to go away?
No. No, it's in the statute. So
I know.
it's and you have all of the case law that's been developed over the year. I think it's the way that it looks and different analyses and different approaches is going to change. But it's always going to be there, and it's the one law outside of maybe a couple other that provide the public an opportunity to weigh in on what the federal government is doing. So that's kind of my opinion outside of the agency I work for.
Just doing a vibe check, temperature check for everybody.
Yeah, Laura, it's interesting to John's point about the NAP working groups or the NEPA working group, you have the wide range of personalities on there. So you have the doom and gloomers, then you have the other folks who, are like, oh, no, I always like to say if someone new who's like trying to catch up on all this, we're just going to keep doing what we've been doing as far as practitioners. The experienced ones, you got to tweak it a little bit. That's again my opinion.
I'd echo that too. It's law, like it's above executive orders. Implementation can be changed, but it's pretty baked in there. Same with the Clear Air Act and Clean Water Act. So I don't know. Don't get too worried, Laura, or start building your resume as a cooking chef or something else.
Masonry. I feel like there's not enough mason in the world now.
Oh yeah, the trades are growing again.
Welding. I've always wanted to learn to weld. I'm kidding. I'm just kidding.
Well, and even not with NEPA. I mean, the Clean Water Act with the SACA decision. So it's another pendulum swing. What is the water of the U.S.? Well, it's not. And so EPA and the Army Corps are going through trying to figure out how to sync that up with the SACA decision, because everyone's like, what is?
ESA is under attack too with trying to rescind the definition of harm.
Yeah.
I'm actually more worried that ESA is going to go away than NEPA.
It's certainly more, ESA is certainly more, it would be more sensational, right? I mean, it would be a bigger political, people know about that more than they know about NEPA.
Have you guys heard anything about that change in definition and how that will affect things? Or if it's actually going to happen?
I've heard that it's probably going to happen, but it's also probably going to get litigated a lot.
Yeah, I'm kind of up to speed on it. I think the Fish and Wildlife Service has released their initial or interim rule on what the definition of harm is going to be. Yeah, and to Julie's point, yeah, it's basically the connection about the critical habitat. If you modify that definition and you say, well, you take that piece out, which is a big piece of each of the species, then yeah, that's what some folks are saying would be a big cut on the ESA. Is how can you take care of the species if you can't take care of its habitat? I think I
Yeah,
captured
so
it correctly.
my understanding of it is that yeah, essentially what Chris said, you're basically taking away protections of habitat and indirect impacts to the species. So basically, the only thing that would be evaluated under the Endangered Species Act anymore is direct impacts. So that's a would be a big loss.
Yeah, and to your point, Julia, the agencies are going to release these rules, and they're going to go through and do everything at the behest of the person in charge, and there will be lots of lawsuits. Again, if I guess in our industry, if you're a lawyer, you're always going to have a job, and if you're especially a water lawyer, if Carrie was on, you would have no shortage of work.
Well, anyone else to help kind of any other questions for Chris? Carrie never got on, so I'll kind of help try to maybe wrap it up here. Anything else that you want to offer, Chris, or we can stop our recording? You are muted, Chris.
Yeah, you'd think that the big thing that pops up saying you're muted would work, but I guess it depends on the background too, because I had your beautiful window behind that now. No, with that, yeah, everything's changing, so it's great if you can. There's no shortage of attention needed to what's going on. So I think having everyone here in this organization can provide valuable input, and each of us are in different areas as far as keeping up to things. So I think being in this group is a great way to, cherry pick everybody's brain and see where everything is at. Well, that's kind of it with what I have to say. Thank you, Pat.
No, we'll say that's a good plug for our next get together on June 12th at Loose Screw Brewing in Meridian. You want to keep talking about NEPA and what's going on there? That's a great chance for us to keep that conversation going with like-minded individuals.
Yeah, you have to do